I'm 38 years old and never been able to get a girlfriend. At 38 years old, the weight of my solitary existence felt heavier than ever. It wasn't just the lack of a girlfriend, it was the accumulation of years spent watching others find love, build lives together, and experience the kind of connection I had always yearned for but never seemed able to grasp. My life had become a series of moments defined by quiet longing and the ache of unfulfilled dreams. I had always thought there would be time. In my 20s, I believed I was just figuring myself out, that I wasn't ready for something as serious as a relationship. When I turned 30, I told myself that my focus on my career was the reason I hadn't settled down. But as the years passed, excuses became harder to make, and the loneliness became harder to ignore. Every birthday was a reminder of how little had changed. I'd watched friends fall in love, get married, and start families. I'd been the best man at 2 weddings and a groomsman. In 3 others, each time, I'd stood at the altar with them, smiling and clapping as they exchanged vows, but I could never quite shake the hollow feeling that followed me home. After the toasts and the laughter and the cake, I'd lie awake at night, wondering if I was destined to always be the guest, never the groom. It wasn't that I hadn't tried. In my 20s, I'd asked women out, only to be met with polite declines or the dreaded "let's just be friends." I joined dating apps when they became popular, optimistically swiping right on profiles that seemed to align with my interests. I crafted messages with care, trying to strike the perfect balance of wit and sincerity. Sometimes, there were matches and brief exchanges, but they rarely led to anything more. The conversations fizzled out, and I was left staring at a screen, wondering what I had done wrong. Over time, my confidence began to erode. Each rejection, each failed attempt, felt like a small confirmation that I wasn't good enough. Maybe I wasn't attractive enough, or interesting enough, or charming enough. I'd spend hours analyzing my flaws, picking apart my appearance, my personality, my choices, trying to understand why I seemed to repel the very thing I wanted most. By the time I reached my mid-30s, I had stopped trying as much. The sting of rejection had become too sharp, and the hope I once carried had grown dim. I told myself I didn't need anyone, that I was fine on my own, but deep down, I knew it wasn't true. The truth was in the way I lingered too long on Instagram posts of happy couples, the way I avoided Valentine's Day like it was a personal affront, the way I felt a pang of envy when friends shared ultrasound pictures or stories about their kids' first steps. Family gatherings were the hardest. Every holiday seemed to come with the same well-meaning but painful questions. So, are you seeing anyone? When are you going to settle down? My parents, bless them, tried to hide their disappointment, but I could see it in their eyes, in the way my mom's smile faltered when I told her there was no one in my life. My dad, ever the pragmatist, once suggested I try speed dating, a suggestion that had only made me feel more pathetic. The loneliness wasn't just emotional, it was physical too. My apartment was neat and orderly, but it always felt too quiet, too still. The evenings stretched endlessly, filled with the hum of the TV or the click of my keyboard as I scrolled aimlessly through social media. I'd cook dinner for one, eat in silence, and then sink into bed, staring at the ceiling as sleep eluded me. There were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. On my worst days, I'd spiral into self-pity, convinced that I was fundamentally broken, that there was something wrong with me that made me unworthy of love. I'd think about the milestones I'd missed: holding someone's hand in the park, sharing a first kiss, celebrating an anniversary. These were moments that so many people took for granted, but to me, they felt like dreams I'd never touch. Therapy became a lifeline for me in my late 30s. I started seeing a counselor after a particularly dark period when the loneliness felt suffocating. In our sessions, I began to unpack the layers of my struggles: the fear of rejection, the self-doubt, the walls I'd built around myself to protect against further pain. It wasn't an easy process. Confronting my feelings meant facing the parts of myself I didn't want to acknowledge, the parts that felt unworthy and unlovable. Slowly, I started to challenge those beliefs. I began to see that my worth wasn't tied to whether or not someone loved me, that I was deserving of connection simply because I existed. It was a small but significant shift, and it gave me the courage to try again. I started saying yes to invitations, even when I felt awkward or out of place. I joined a local hiking group, not necessarily to meet someone, but to connect with people and break out of the isolation I'd built around myself. I rediscovered hobbies I'd abandoned, playing guitar, painting, even writing poetry, and found joy in them again, independent of anyone else's approval. One evening, as I walked home from a group event, I realized that for the first time in years, I didn't feel completely alone. I still didn't have a girlfriend, but I had hope. I had a growing belief that my story wasn't over, that there was still time for love, connection, for all the moments I'd dreamed of. At 38, I was still waiting for my first real relationship, but I was learning to be at peace with where I was. I didn't know if or when it would happen, but I was starting to believe that I was worth loving, and that was the most important step of all. The realization that I was worth loving wasn't a sudden fix to everything. It was more like a seed, planted deep in my chest, that needed constant nurturing to grow. There were still bad days, moments when the familiar doubts crept back in, whispering that maybe I was fooling myself. But for every dark moment, there were new ones that felt lighter, brighter glimmers of possibility that I hadn't allowed myself to see before. The hiking group became a regular part of my life. I wasn't the most athletic, but I showed up, trudging up trails and learning the names of wildflowers. The people there were friendly, welcoming in a way that made the awkwardness of being the new guy fade quickly. I didn't join expecting to meet anyone romantically, but I found something equally valuable: connection. I started making friends, people who genuinely enjoyed my company and who saw me as someone worth knowing. One of those new friends, Eric, encouraged me to join him at a community cooking class. It was completely out of my comfort zone, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. I spent the first session fumbling with knives and feeling like a fish out of water, but by the end of the night, I realized I'd actually had fun. Cooking, I discovered, wasn't just about making food. It was about sharing an experience, about laughter over burnt attempts and celebrating small victories, like finally perfecting a souffle. Through these little steps, my life began to feel fuller. My evenings, once marked by silence and the glow of a screen, were now spent among people, trying new things, laughing, and sometimes even embarrassing myself. I found that the more I embraced these moments, the less fixated I became on the idea of having a girlfriend as the sole marker of my happiness. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building a life that didn't hinge on what I lacked but celebrated what I had. Then, one Saturday, something unexpected happened. During a group outing to a local farmer's market, I bumped into a woman carrying an armful of flowers. Literally, she dropped half of them when I accidentally collided with her while distracted by a stall of baked goods. I scrambled to help her pick them up, muttering apologies as I handed her a bouquet of sunflowers. She laughed, a warm, easy laugh that made me feel like the sun had just come out from behind the clouds. Her name was Clara. She wasn't part of our group. She was just there shopping for her sister's birthday. She thanked me for the help and walked off, but something about her lingered in my mind long after she was gone. I thought about her the rest of the day, replaying that brief interaction in my head. A week later, I saw her again at the market. This time, I didn't hesitate. I approached her, nervously introducing myself and reminding her of our flower collision. She remembered and smiled, and for the first time in years, I felt like the universe had handed me a moment of pure possibility. Our connection wasn't immediate fireworks, but it was steady and genuine. Clara was kind, funny, and refreshingly down to earth. She appreciated the little things in life: a good cup of coffee, walk through the park, the joy of cooking a new recipe. As we got to know each other, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years. I told her about my struggles, my doubts, my loneliness. Instead of judging me, she listened, her eyes full of understanding. Clara wasn't a miracle fix to my life, but she was a reminder that love, in all its forms, was still possible. Being with her wasn't about filling a void or completing some checklist, it was about sharing moments, about being seen and valued for who I truly was. Looking back, I realized that every step I'd taken, joining the hiking group, attending the cooking classes, learning to embrace my own worth, had prepared me for this. I had learned to build a life that felt meaningful on its own, and in doing so, I had made space for someone else to join me in it. At 38, I had spent years thinking love had passed me by, that I was destined to be alone. But now, as I walked hand in hand with Clara through the farmer's market, I understood that it was never too late. Love wasn't something I had to chase or force, it was something that grew naturally when I started to believe I was deserving of it. And for the first time in my life, I truly felt that I was. The weeks that followed my connection with Clara were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Every encounter with her felt like peeling back another layer of who we were, like discovering a new chapter in a story I didn't know I'd get to live. She had a way of making even the simplest moments feel significant, whether it was sharing a coffee on her tiny balcony, where we laughed about the quirky neighbors below, or wandering through the local park, where she stopped to admire every blooming flower as if it were a masterpiece. But the more time I spent with her, the more I found myself battling old fears. What if this didn't last? What if I wasn't enough? Those insecurities, so deeply ingrained, were hard to shake. I caught myself analyzing every text I sent her, every interaction we had, searching for signs that I was saying or doing the wrong thing. My mind, trained by years of rejection, was on high alert for the moment this happiness would be taken away. One evening, after she'd gone home from a dinner we had cooked together, I sat on my couch, staring at the empty plate she'd left behind. The joy of her presence lingered in the air, but so did the knowing doubt that maybe I didn't deserve this, that someone like Clara was too good for someone like me. I couldn't stop replaying small moments in my head. Did I talk too much? Did she really laugh at my joke? Or was she just being polite? It was exhausting, the way my mind could take something beautiful and twist it into something fraught with uncertainty. I brought these feelings up in therapy, admitting how scared I was to let myself fully believe in the possibility of happiness. My therapist reminded me that it was okay to feel vulnerable, that love always came with risks. She told me that the fact I was willing to try, even with all my fears, was a sign of how far I'd come. The fear doesn't mean something's wrong, she said. It means you care. Clara never gave me any reason to doubt her feelings, but I knew I couldn't keep letting my insecurities build walls between us. So, I made a choice. I started focusing on the present, on what I knew, not what I feared. When she laughed at my jokes, I chose to believe it was genuine. When she reached for my hand, I let myself feel the warmth of her touch instead of questioning why she wanted to hold it. Our relationship wasn't perfect, no relationship is. There were moments of misunderstanding, of miscommunication. Clara was fiercely independent, and at times, I struggled to find my place in her world. But every time we hit a bump, we worked through it. She had a way of grounding me, of reminding me that love wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, about being willing to try even when things got hard. One day, as we walked through the park, she stopped and turned to me, her eyes serious. She told me she could see how much I doubted myself sometimes, how I seemed to carry the weight of all the years I'd spent feeling unworthy. She said she didn't need me to be perfect, or confident, or anything other than who I was. "You're enough," she said. The words hit me like a wave, breaking through the years of self-doubt I had carried. For the first time, I started to believe them. Being with Clara taught me that love wasn't about finding someone to fix you, it was about finding someone who saw you, who accepted you as you were, and who inspired you to keep growing. And as I grew, I started to see myself through her eyes, not as a man who had failed, but as a man who had survived, who had kept his heart open despite everything. At 38, I had spent my whole life believing I was unlovable. At 39, I knew that wasn't true. Love hadn't come to me in the way I'd imagined, and it hadn't come on the timeline I'd expected, but it had come, and it had been worth every lonely night, every moment of doubt, every step I'd taken to get there. Looking back, I realized that Clara wasn't just a chapter in my story, she was part of a new beginning. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to turn the page. As Clara and I continued to build our life together, it became clear how transformative love could be, not just in the romantic sense, but in the way it opened doors to parts of myself I hadn't known existed. With her by my side, I began to see the world differently, with a sense of curiosity and wonder that had been dulled by years of isolation. She made me want to try to explore, to live more boldly. One afternoon, Clara suggested we take a weekend trip to the coast. I hesitated at first, instinctively leaning into my usual routines, but her enthusiasm was contagious. We packed a bag, rented a tiny cabin by the beach, and spent 2 days soaking up the salty breeze and the sound of waves crashing against the shore. I had never felt so at peace, sitting with her on the sand as the sun dipped below the horizon. It struck me then how much I'd missed out on, not because I hadn't found love earlier, but because I had let fear keep me from experiencing life fully. Clara wasn't a savior, nor did she want to be. She encouraged me to seek out joy independently, to do things that made me happy just for the sake of it. She joined me sometimes, but also gave me the space to grow on my own. I picked up my guitar again, this time not as a distraction but as a genuine outlet for expression. I started painting badly at first, but with increasing confidence. I even signed up for a small local art show, where I displayed a few pieces and watched nervously as strangers admired them. Clara showed up, of course, cheering louder than anyone. But love, as I came to learn, isn't without its trials. A few months into our relationship, Clara lost her grandmother, a woman who had been like a second mother to her. It was the first time I saw Clara's vibrant energy dim. She retreated into herself, and for a while, I worried that I wouldn't know how to support her. But instead of trying to fix it, I simply showed up. I sat with her in her silence, brought her tea when she didn't ask for it, and listened when she was ready to talk. It wasn't about having the perfect words, it was about being present. Through her grief, I learned that love sometimes meant just holding space for someone. The months turned into a year, and with it came milestones I had once thought were out of reach for me. Meeting her family was nerve-wracking, but they welcomed me with warmth and curiosity. I found myself laughing over stories about Clara's childhood and feeling a sense of belonging I hadn't known I was missing. The experience of being seen not just by her but by the people who mattered to her was humbling and overwhelming in the best way. Eventually, Clara moved into my apartment. The space that had once felt so quiet and empty now overflowed with life. Her books lined the shelves next to mine, her laughter filled the rooms, and her energy turned the apartment into a home. It wasn't without its challenges, adjusting to each other's habits, sharing a small bathroom, compromising on everything from furniture to what to watch on TV, but every little hurdle felt like a step toward building something real and lasting. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, Clara asked me about my dreams, not the practical ones, like career goals or finances, but the big, wild, impossible dreams I had buried long ago. No one had ever asked me that before, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. Slowly, I began to share the fragments of dreams I'd carried in secret, traveling to places I'd only read about, writing a book, starting a project that might inspire others. Clara listened intently, her eyes sparkling with encouragement. "Why not?" she said, and it was the first time I truly believed that maybe those dreams weren't so impossible after all. That night, after she'd fallen asleep, I stayed awake, thinking about how far I'd come. A year ago, I was a man who had resigned himself to a life of loneliness, who had built walls around his heart to protect it from breaking further. Now, those walls were gone, replaced by the steady foundation of love, not just Clara's love, but my growing love for myself. Clara wasn't the only catalyst for this transformation, but she was the mirror that showed me what I was capable of. She reflected back to me the strength I hadn't recognized, the resilience that had carried me through years of doubt and pain. With her, I learned that love doesn't arrive to complete you. It arrives to show you that you were complete all along. As we curled up on the couch together, her head resting on my shoulder, I felt something I had rarely known: gratitude. For her, for the life we were building, and for the journey that had brought me to this point. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was real, and it was mine. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. As the seasons passed, life with Clara felt like an ever-evolving dance. We found a rhythm together, learning the subtleties of each other's moods and the quiet ways in which we showed love. There were still moments of tension, misunderstandings, small arguments, and the occasional frustration that came from being two separate people trying to make a life together. But we were learning how to navigate those moments with patience and grace, not as obstacles, but as opportunities to understand one another more deeply. It wasn't always easy. There were times when the weight of the past would come creeping back, and I'd feel myself retreating into old habits, the old habit of shutting down, of thinking I wasn't good enough, of expecting the worst. Clara, ever patient, would gently pull me out of those spirals. She would remind me that we weren't perfect, that we didn't need to be. We were just two people trying to build something meaningful together. Her steadiness in those moments became a source of strength for me, something I hadn't realized I needed so badly. Around the time we celebrated our second anniversary, something unexpected happened. Clara got an offer for a job opportunity in another city, a place that was hours away from where we lived. It was a dream position for her, one she'd worked for years to get, but it came with the kind of life-changing decision I hadn't expected us to face so soon. She asked me how I felt about it, and I realized just how much I had come to rely on the life we had built together. The thought of her leaving was unbearable, but I also knew this was her chance to grow, to follow her own dreams, just as I had learned to follow mine. In the days that followed, we talked, agonized over what to do, and considered every possibility. I had spent so much of my life being afraid to make big changes that the idea of her moving felt like it would break me. But in the quiet of our home, surrounded by the familiar objects that had once seemed so ordinary, our mismatched mugs, the paintings I had done, the pictures we'd taken together, something shifted. I realized that the love we had built didn't depend on proximity. Love wasn't confined to one place, one city, or one routine. It was in the choices we made, in the sacrifices we were willing to endure, and in the trust we had in each other. After many long conversations, Clara made the difficult decision to take the job. It wasn't easy for either of us, but I understood that this was a step she needed to take for herself, and I couldn't stand in the way of her growth. In the end, we promised each other that no matter the distance, we would keep our connection strong. We agreed that love wasn't about holding on too tightly, but about giving each other the freedom to grow, even if it meant being apart for a while. The transition was hard. The first few weeks were filled with the ache of her absence, the silence in the apartment so much louder without her. But as the months went on, we learned how to make our relationship work in this new chapter. We traveled back and forth to see each other, sharing our days over phone calls and video chats. It wasn't the same as living together, but the space gave us both room to grow in ways we hadn't anticipated. Clara flourished in her new role, and I embraced my own passions with a renewed focus: writing, traveling, and creating the life I had always imagined for myself, separate from the loneliness I had once feared. The distance between us became a testing ground, not just for the strength of our relationship, but for our individual resilience. The uncertainty that had once filled me with dread now felt more manageable. I no longer feared that being apart would mean the end of our love. Instead, it was a chance for us to discover what it meant to truly stand on our own feet, while still holding each other up from afar. When Clara came to visit after a few months, we found ourselves rediscovering each other in small but meaningful ways. We had grown and changed during the time apart, but in the best way possible. Our reunion was bittersweet but also joyful, because it felt like we had both embraced the lessons of distance, and we had learned how to love each other not just in the same space, but through time and distance, in ways we had never thought possible. Years went by, and while the physical distance remained for a while, our bond only deepened. We learned to embrace the beauty of a love that wasn't confined by geography or timelines. In the end, we discovered that love, in its purest form, wasn't about never being apart. It was about supporting each other, no matter where we were, and believing in the connection we had built together. The fear that had once defined my life, fear of never being loved, fear of being alone, fear of making the wrong choices, faded over time. What remained was the quiet certainty that I had found something real. Clara had shown me that love wasn't just about finding someone to fill a void. It was about finding someone who made the journey feel worth it, no matter how long it took. And for that, I would be forever grateful. The story of my life, once filled with silence and longing, had been rewritten in ways I never expected, and as I stood at the edge of a new chapter with Clara, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, stronger, wiser, and with a love that had weathered every storm.